Chapter 35, The Cat Hysterectomy. The next year, Eddie took one of those advanced biology classes. He worked on a month-long project on rats. First, he learned how to anesthetize them with a little cylinder of cardboard that had an ether-soaked cotton ball in it. Next, he learned how to operate on them. His experiment involved hormone-related physiological changes. What that meant was he had to neuter both a male and a female rat, and after a few weeks put them down and do an autopsy to reveal what changes had occurred. It sounded pretty straightforward when the professor explained it to them, but when the moment came to euthanize his rats, Eddie struggled. He managed to go through with it, and even made a good grade, but he determined he'd rather operate on rats than kill them any day. When he got home to West Virginia that summer, he was met by his brother Jimmy. "Eddie, I've got bad news," he said. "Dad says my cat, Tigger, is having too many babies, and he's going to have to do something about it." Now, something about it on a farm usually involved a gunny sack and the river. Eddie looked up at the sky and stroked his chin. His mind was whirling. He thought about his biology experiment and his little brother's predicament. Rat, cat, how different could they be? "Jimmy," he said in his most reassuring way, "I can help you. I've been off to school, and I've learned a thing or two. Give me a few days to gather my equipment, and we'll fix Tigger right up." A few days later, Eddie rode to Madison, the county seat, with his folks, and he made a stop at the drugstore. Did they have a can of ether they would sell a 16-year-old? "Of course. What else can we do for you?" Looking back on it, it does make you wonder. Well, when Eddie got home, he rounded up an old fish tank and an unused refrigerator rack. He found a piece of plywood that would work as a cover for the tank, and then he made sure his mother's sewing kit was well supplied and asked to borrow the hair clippers. All was in place, so he waited until his folks were conveniently away one Saturday morning, and he assembled his brothers. "Boys," he said, "we've got a problem. Dad is going to have to do something to Tigger if she keeps having so many kittens. But I've got a plan. Go get your bathrobes." When the boys got back, Eddie had them put the robes on backwards, like surgeons, and cover their mouths with one of their dad's handkerchiefs. He spread a bedsheet over the dining room table and hoisted the old fish tank onto it. He poured a few splashes of ether inside, lowered the refrigerator rack onto the wooden blocks, and readied the plywood lid. "Get Tigger," he said, and Greg and Gray raced off to produce the cat. She was lowered into the tank, and Eddie capped the lid in place. Tigger looked a bit worried as she stared at the boys through the glass, but not for long. After a few seconds, she started to get sleepy and then lay down, unconscious. The boys pulled her limp form from the tank and spread her gently on the bed sheet. "Jimmy," said Eddie, "this is your cat, so I'm giving you the most critical job. You're to be the anesthetist. You see this cone with the cotton ball in the end? It's got ether on it. You have to carefully watch this cat and adjust the airflow. If Tigger starts to breathe fast, you pull the cone up closer over her face. If she starts to breathe slowly, you pull it back so she can get more oxygen. You got it?" Jimmy nodded, deadly serious. He really loved his cat, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Next, the hair clippers were produced, and Tigger was carefully shaved down both sides of her body. The boys swabbed alcohol on the incision sites and then produced their mother's sewing scissors. Eddie made a 3-inch incision down her right side and began to carefully probe, looking for her ovaries. He gently moved organs around until he located the uterus. Following it up, he came to the fallopian tube, which led to the right ovary. So far, so good. Taking a piece of white sewing thread, he carefully tied off the ovarian artery and then made a clip with scissors. Lifting his head and smiling triumphantly, he held the ovary aloft. "That's one," he said. "Now for the other. Jimmy, you okay?" Jimmy nodded, just a bit woozily from bending over the ether cone so intently. The boys returned to the sewing kit and found a needle to stitch up Tigger's right side. Then they gently flipped her over and made the second incision. Again, Eddie poked and probed. He asked for more light. The clock ticked and timed passed. After a half hour had gone by, Eddie was beginning to feel lightheaded as well. He looked everywhere and had not been able to locate Tigger's left ovary. Maybe his assumption that rats and cats were the same had been a bit optimistic. After another 15 minutes, Eddie made a tactical decision. Ovary or no ovary, it was time to close Tigger up. They stitched her left side together and removed the ether cone. The minutes dragged by as they waited for signs of life. Finally, Tigger blinked and let out a weak meow. Eddie popped an aspirin in her mouth and rubbed her throat until she swallowed. Then the boys put her in a box with a soft towel in the bottom and laid her in a dark corner to recover. And all was well. For about 3 days. Then Jimmy came running to Eddie, his eyes open wide. "It's Tigger," he gasped. "She's chewed her stitches out. What are we going to do?" he cried. Eddie looked at the ground and felt like swearing. This hadn't happened in the lab. Well, there was only one thing to do.